The wedding invitation arrived on expensive cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that screamed money. Marcus Chen and Rebecca Sullivan were getting married at the Riverside Country Club, and somehow, my name had made it onto their guest list. I stared at the invitation for a long moment, running my fingers over the raised text. 3 years. It had been 3 years since I'd spoken to either of them. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had once called me a basement dweller and a tech nerd with no future were now inviting me to witness their perfect union. But I decided to go anyway. After all, I had nothing to lose. What I didn't expect was the phone call that came 2 weeks before the wedding. "Hey Alex, it's Rebecca." Her voice was strained, awkward. "Listen, I need to talk to you about the wedding." And just like that, I knew exactly what was coming. I met Marcus and Rebecca during my senior year at Northwestern University. We were all computer science majors, though Marcus had switched from business after his father threatened to cut off his trust fund if he didn't get a real degree. Rebecca was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, but she had this way of making you feel small when she disagreed with you. They started dating junior year, and I became the third wheel who tagged along to study groups and late-night coding sessions. Back then, I was the classic stereotype. Thick glasses, worn-out hoodies, and a laptop that was held together with electrical tape and determination. My dorm room looked like a Radio Shack had exploded. Circuit boards, tangled cables, and towers of energy drink cans stacked precariously on every surface. Marcus used to joke that I lived like a mad scientist, and Rebecca would laugh, but not in a mean way. At least, I didn't think it was mean at the time. The three of us spent countless hours in the computer lab, working on projects that seemed impossible back then. I remember one particular night during our senior year when we were struggling with a machine learning algorithm for our capstone project. Marcus had given up around midnight, muttering something about calling his dad for a job at his investment firm. Rebecca lasted until 2 a.m. before declaring the whole thing academically interesting, but commercially useless. Quote, "I stayed until sunrise. Something about that algorithm fascinated me. It wasn't just about pattern recognition. It was about prediction, about seeing connections that human minds couldn't process fast enough. While my classmates saw it as an assignment to complete, I saw it as a glimpse into the future. I modified the original parameters, fed it different data sets, and watched as it began to learn in ways that surprised even me. When I presented my enhanced version to Professor Williams the next week, he stared at the screen for a long time without saying anything. Finally, he looked up at me and said, "Alex, this isn't just an A-plus project. This is something else entirely." Marcus and Rebecca congratulated me, but I could see something shift in their expressions. It was subtle. A tightening around Rebecca's eyes, a forced quality to Marcus's smile. For the first time, I had done something they couldn't easily dismiss or improve upon. After graduation, we all moved to different cities. Marcus landed a position at his father's firm in Chicago. Rebecca got hired by a prestigious consulting company in New York, and I moved back to my hometown of Columbus, Ohio, into my parents' basement. The basement dweller joke started immediately. "Still living the dream down there, Alex?" Marcus would text me photos of his downtown Chicago apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of Lake Michigan. Rebecca was more subtle, but no less cutting. She'd share articles about emerging professionals and career trajectory optimization, with comments like, "Thought you might find this interesting." The subtext was clear. While she was climbing corporate ladders, I was stagnating in my childhood bedroom. What they didn't know was that I wasn't stagnating at all. Those first 2 years in my parents' basement were the most productive of my life. I took that machine learning algorithm from college and began expanding it, refining it, teaching it to do things that shouldn't have been possible with the computing power I had access to. I maxed out credit cards buying servers, filled the basement with humming machines that made the electric bill skyrocket, and survived on ramen noodles and my mother's increasingly worried attempts to get me to find a real job. My parents were patient, but I could see the strain. Dad would come downstairs sometimes, ostensibly to check on the water heater, but really to see if I was okay. Mom would leave plates of food at the top of the stairs like I was some kind of hermit. They never said it directly, but I knew they were wondering if their son had become one of those people. The ones who never launched, who lived in their parents' houses until they were 40, sustained by video games and delusions of grandeur. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in March, almost 2 years after graduation. I had been working on a predictive analytics system that could analyze market trends across multiple industries simultaneously. The algorithm could process news feeds, social media sentiment, patent filings, supply chain data, and hundreds of other variables to predict everything from stock prices to consumer behavior patterns weeks in advance. I ran a test on the pharmaceutical sector, feeding the system everything I could find about upcoming FDA approvals, clinical trial results, and market speculation. The algorithm identified 3 small biotech companies that were dramatically undervalued based on the likelihood of their drug approvals. I had $847 in my checking account, literally my last dollars before I would have had to get a job at Best Buy or somewhere similar. I put it all on those 3 stocks. 6 weeks later, all 3 companies received FDA approval for their respective drugs. My $847 became $23,000 overnight. But that was just the beginning. I reinvested everything, expanding the algorithm's capabilities, teaching it to identify patterns across dozens of markets simultaneously. The system began making predictions that seemed almost supernatural in their accuracy. A small renewable energy company whose technology was about to revolutionize solar panel efficiency. A logistics startup that Amazon would acquire for their drone delivery program. A cybersecurity firm that would land a massive government contract 3 months before anyone else saw it coming. Within 8 months, my basement operation had generated over $2 million in returns. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not my college friends, not even the accountant I eventually had to hire to help manage the tax implications. I lived the same way I always had: ramen noodles, secondhand clothes, and a 15-year-old Honda Civic that made concerning noises when I accelerated too quickly. Meanwhile, Marcus and Rebecca kept in touch sporadically, their messages always carrying that same undertone of pity mixed with superiority. Marcus would send updates about his promotions, his new car, his weekend trips to Miami. Rebecca shared photos from work conferences in San Francisco and London, always looking polished and successful in her designer suits. "Still coding away down there?" she'd ask during our rare phone calls. "You know, Marcus's firm is always looking for people with technical skills. I could put in a word." I'd thank her politely and change the subject. The truth was, by the end of my 2nd year in the basement, my predictive analytics system had evolved into something much bigger. I wasn't just making smart investments anymore. I was building an empire. I had quietly founded 3 different companies. One focused on AI-driven market analysis, another developing predictive algorithms for supply chain optimization, and a third that licensed proprietary forecasting technology to Fortune 500 companies. None of these companies bore my name or had public-facing websites. They operated through a network of shell corporations and holding companies that I'd established with the help of attorneys who specialized in high-net-worth privacy protection. To the outside world, Alex Morrison was still the basement dweller who couldn't figure out his life. In reality, Alex Morrison was building something that would eventually be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The wedding invitation arrived during my 3rd year of operations. By then, my various enterprises were generating enough revenue that I'd had to establish a proper office space, though I kept that fact to myself as well. The invitation felt like a message from another lifetime, a reminder of who I used to be before I discovered what I was actually capable of. I almost didn't go. What was the point? Marcus and Rebecca had made it clear over the years that they saw me as a cautionary tale, a smart kid who had somehow failed to translate his intelligence into real-world success. Showing up at their wedding would just confirm their narrative about themselves as the ones who had made it while I remained stuck in adolescence. But something made me keep the invitation on my desk. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a desire to see how they'd changed. Or maybe, deep down, I wanted to witness what they thought success looked like compared to what I had quietly built. 2 weeks before the wedding, Rebecca called. "Hey, Alex, it's Rebecca." Her voice had that same confident tone I remembered from college. But there was something else underneath it, a tension that hadn't been there before. Listen, I need to talk to you about the wedding. I waited. The thing is, we've had to make some adjustments to the guest list. The venue has capacity restrictions we didn't anticipate, and Marcus's family is much larger than we originally planned for. She paused, and I could practically hear her searching for the right words. We're really sorry, but we're going to have to uninvite some people. It's nothing personal. We're cutting college friends across the board to make room for family. The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. Marcus came from a family of 4, and I knew for a fact that Rebecca's side was equally small. But I also understood what was really happening. Someone had decided that having the basement dweller at their elegant country club wedding didn't fit the image they wanted to project. I understand, I said simply. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. You're not upset? Rebecca sounded surprised, maybe even a little disappointed that I wasn't fighting back. Not at all. Have a wonderful wedding. After she hung up, I sat in my office, my real office, with its wall of monitors displaying real-time market data from around the world, and realized that I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no sense of betrayal, just a mild curiosity about what would happen if they ever discovered who I had actually become. The decision to attend the wedding anyway came to me 3 days later while I was reviewing quarterly reports for my portfolio companies. My AI division had just secured a contract with Tesla to optimize their supply chain predictions, worth $47 million over 2 years. The irony struck me like lightning. Here I was, quietly revolutionizing how major corporations operated, while my college friends thought I was too much of a failure to attend their wedding. I called my assistant Jennifer Walsh, who had been managing my public-facing affairs for the past year. Jennifer was a former executive assistant to tech billionaires, and she understood the delicate balance of maintaining privacy while wielding significant influence behind the scenes. I need you to handle something unusual, I told her. I'm attending a wedding where the hosts expect me to arrive as a nobody. I want to keep it that way until the right moment. Jennifer didn't ask questions. That's why I paid her 6 figures annually. The Riverside Country Club sat on 200 acres of manicured perfection in Lake Forest, Illinois. As my Uber dropped me off at the circular drive, I couldn't help but notice the parade of luxury vehicles lined up for valet service. Bentleys, Porsches, and Mercedes-Benzes gleamed under the afternoon sun, each one probably worth more than most people's houses. I stepped out wearing a suit I'd bought off the rack at Men's Warehouse, deliberately unremarkable, carefully chosen to reinforce the image Marcus and Rebecca had of me. The valet looked at my arrival with barely concealed confusion, clearly wondering how someone who couldn't afford his own car had ended up at this particular event. The country club's interior was everything I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers, mahogany paneling, and oil paintings of long-dead industrialists who'd probably never worked a day in their lives. Guests mingled in clusters, their conversations a blend of business name-dropping and vacation destination comparisons. I recognized the type immediately. People for whom wealth was both an identity and a competitive sport. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and found a corner where I could observe without drawing attention. The bride and groom were holding court near the bar, surrounded by admirers who seemed genuinely delighted to be in their presence. Rebecca looked stunning in her designer gown, every inch the successful professional who'd transcended her middle-class origins. Marcus had filled out since college, his face carrying the confidence that comes from never having to wonder where your next meal is coming from. Alex? Alex Morrison? I turned to find David Kim, another classmate from Northwestern. David had gone into patent law and clearly done well for himself, judging by his Armani suit and Rolex Submariner. David, good to see you. I shook his hand, noting how his grip lingered as if he was trying to assess my current station in life through physical contact alone. I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you here, David said, his tone carefully neutral. I heard through the grapevine that Rebecca and Marcus were being pretty selective about the guest list. Last-minute addition, I said simply. David nodded knowingly. Well, it's good that you made it. Are you still doing the tech thing? I remember you were always brilliant with computers. Something like that. That's great, man. Really great. David's smile had the quality of someone trying to be encouraging to a person they fundamentally pitied. The tech industry is so hot right now, I'm sure you'll find your breakthrough soon. Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught our attention. A small crowd had gathered around someone who'd just arrived, and I could hear excited murmurs rippling through the room. Is that Jonathan Hayes? David whispered, his voice suddenly reverent. I followed his gaze to see a man in his 50s being greeted like royalty by the other guests. Jonathan Hayes was a venture capitalist whose firm had backed some of the biggest tech success stories of the past decade. His presence at the wedding suggested that Marcus or Rebecca had connections I hadn't been aware of. How do Marcus and Rebecca know Jonathan Hayes? I asked. Marcus's dad does business with Hayes Capital, David explained. Real estate development stuff. Word is that Jonathan's been mentoring Marcus, helping him transition from finance into venture capital. I watched as Marcus introduced Rebecca to Hayes, both of them practically glowing with excitement. The conversation looked intense, animated, the kind of discussion that probably involved phrases like disruptive innovation and market penetration strategies. Must be nice to have those kinds of connections, David continued. I mean, a recommendation from Jonathan Hayes could open doors that most of us can only dream about. I nodded absently, my attention caught by something else entirely. Hayes was holding what looked like a tablet, and he was showing Marcus and Rebecca something on the screen that was making them increasingly excited. From where I stood, I couldn't see the display, but I could read their body language clearly enough. They were looking at money. Big money. The wedding ceremony itself was a production worthy of a Hollywood movie. The venue's outdoor pavilion had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with white roses and baby's breath creating archways that probably cost more than most people's cars. A string quartet played classical arrangements while 200 guests watched Marcus and Rebecca exchange vows they'd clearly spent months perfecting. I sat in the back row, watching the proceedings with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal rituals. The officiants spoke about love and commitment and the joining of two lives, but all I could think about was the conversation I'd witnessed between the couple and Jonathan Hayes. There had been an urgency to their discussion that went beyond social pleasantries. During the cocktail hour that followed, I found myself gravitating toward the edges of conversations, picking up fragments of business talk that painted an interesting picture. Marcus wasn't just transitioning into venture capital. He was actively seeking investors for some kind of startup idea. Multiple guests mentioned meetings, pitch decks, and funding rounds in ways that suggested this wedding was as much a networking event as a celebration. The artificial intelligence space is absolutely exploding right now, I overheard one guest tell another. Marcus showed me some preliminary numbers last week that were just incredible. If they can execute on even half of what they're proposing, we could be looking at the next unicorn. I moved closer, pretending to examine the ice sculpture while listening to their conversation. What exactly are they building? The second guest asked. Predictive analytics for financial markets. The algorithm can supposedly forecast stock movements with 93% accuracy. Marcus says they've been beta testing it for 6 months with phenomenal results. My blood went cold. I excused myself and walked quickly toward the men's room, my mind racing. Predictive analytics for financial markets, 93% accuracy. Beta testing for 6 months. The timeline matched perfectly with some of my own company's most successful market predictions. Inside the bathroom, I pulled out my phone and called Jennifer. I need you to run a background check on Marcus Chen and Rebecca Sullivan, I said without preamble. Corporate filings, patent applications, business registrations, everything you can find from the past year. How deep do you want me to go? Ocean floor. Give me 20 minutes. I returned to the reception just as dinner was being served. The country club's dining room had been arranged with round tables for 10, each one decorated with centerpieces that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. I found my assigned seat at a table near the back, surrounded by people I didn't recognize who seemed equally uncertain about why I was there. The conversation at my table was polite but distant, the kind of small talk that happens when people are trying to figure out your net worth through subtle interrogation. Where did I work? What neighborhood did I live in? What kind of car did I drive? I deflected with practiced ease, giving answers that were technically true but revealed nothing meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Found something interesting. Call me. I excused myself again, this time heading to the club's library, a quiet room lined with leather-bound books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. What did you find? I asked when Jennifer picked up. Your friends have been busy, she said. 3 months ago, Marcus Chen filed incorporation papers for a company called Quantum Prediction Analytics. Rebecca Sullivan is listed as the Chief Technology Officer. They've also filed preliminary patent applications for something called a multivariable market forecasting system. Send me the patent application. Already in your email. I opened the attachment on my phone and felt my hands begin to shake. The technical specifications were identical to the algorithms I'd developed 3 years ago. Not similar. Identical. Even the variable naming conventions were the same ones I'd used in my original code. There's more, Jennifer continued. They've scheduled a Series A funding presentation for next Tuesday. The investor list includes Jonathan Hayes, among others. They're seeking $12 million in initial funding. Based on my technology. It appears that way. Alex, this could be industrial espionage. We should contact our attorneys immediately. I closed my eyes and tried to think clearly. How had they gotten access to my algorithms? The code was stored on secure servers, with multiple layers of encryption. The only people who knew the full scope of my work were Jennifer and my development team, all of whom had signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements backed by severe financial penalties. Then I remembered something. During our senior year at Northwestern, I'd shared some of my early algorithm work with Marcus and Rebecca during our study sessions. Not the complete system, just fragments, proof-of-concept demonstrations that I'd thought were harmless at the time. But if they'd kept those files, and if they were talented enough to reverse-engineer the underlying principles, I need you to do something else, I told Jennifer. Contact our patent attorneys and have them file an emergency provisional patent application for all of my predictive analytics work. I want every algorithm, every methodology, every line of code protected by tomorrow morning. Consider it done. What are you going to do? I looked through the library window at the reception, continuing outside. Marcus and Rebecca were dancing now, lost in their perfect moment, surrounded by guests who believed they were witnessing the beginning of a fairy tale romance. None of them knew they were actually celebrating the launch of a criminal enterprise built on stolen intellectual property. I'm going to enjoy the rest of the wedding, I said, and then I'm going to introduce myself properly to the happy couple. The dancing had begun in earnest by the time I returned to the reception. The country club's ballroom pulsed with energy as couples swayed to a jazz ensemble that Marcus's father had flown in from New York. I positioned myself near the bar, nursing a scotch that cost more per ounce than most people spent on lunch, watching the social dynamics play out like a carefully choreographed performance. Jonathan Hayes had claimed a prime table near the dance floor, surrounded by Chicago's elite venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs. Every few minutes, someone would approach his table with the nervous energy of a supplicant, seeking an audience with royalty. Hayes would listen politely, shake hands, exchange business cards, but I could see his attention constantly drifting back to Marcus and Rebecca. They were his golden couple tonight, his next big discovery. Quite a party, isn't it? I turned to find an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her dress was understated but clearly expensive, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Margaret Hayes, she said, extending her hand. Jonathan's wife. I don't believe we've met. Alex Morrison. I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way her eyes studied my face, as if she was trying to place me. Morrison, she repeated thoughtfully. Are you in tech as well? Jonathan's been talking about nothing but algorithms and predictive analytics all week. Frankly, it's starting to make my head spin. I dabble. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that cut through the wedding's orchestrated perfection. A man, a few words. I appreciate that. Most of the people Jonathan deals with can't seem to stop talking about themselves long enough to have an actual conversation. She gestured toward the dance floor where Marcus was spinning Rebecca in an elaborate turn that drew appreciative applause from the watching guests. Beautiful couple, Margaret continued. Jonathan's quite excited about their business venture. Apparently, they've developed some kind of revolutionary technology that could transform financial forecasting. Are you familiar with their work? I've heard rumors. Well, if even half of what Jonathan tells me is true, we could be looking at billionaires in the making. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, though I have to admit, something about the whole thing makes me slightly uncomfortable. Oh? It's probably nothing, she said, waving a dismissive hand. But Jonathan's been in this business for 30 years, and he's usually much more cautious about new ventures. With Marcus and Rebecca, he seems almost eager, like he's afraid someone else might discover them first. Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew our attention. A small group of men in expensive suits had arrived late, and they were making their way directly toward Jonathan Hayes's table. I recognized one of them immediately, Thomas Chen, Marcus's father, whose development company had been making headlines for their aggressive expansion into commercial real estate. The cavalry has arrived, Margaret murmured. Those are Jonathan's biggest investors. If they're here, it means tonight is about much more than celebrating a wedding. I watched as Thomas Chen shook hands with Jonathan Hayes, their conversation immediately intense, despite the festive atmosphere around them. Within minutes, Marcus had abandoned the dance floor and joined the impromptu business meeting, his wedding reception temporarily forgotten in favor of what was clearly a high-stakes negotiation. Rebecca remained on the dance floor for a moment, looking abandoned and slightly confused, before one of her bridesmaids rescued her with a glass of champagne and some animated conversation about her dress. But I could see her attention kept drifting back to the table, where her new husband was deep in discussion with men who held his financial future in their hands. My phone buzzed with another message from Jennifer. Emergency patent filings completed. Also found something else. Marcus Chen's company has scheduled a demonstration for potential investors tomorrow morning. They're claiming their system can predict market movements with unprecedented accuracy. I texted back, what kind of demonstration? Live market analysis. They're planning to make real-time predictions and show the results to investors within hours. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had they stolen my technology, but they were now planning to demonstrate it publicly to secure funding. The problem was, they were using incomplete information. The fragments of code I'd shared during college were powerful, but they were just pieces of a much larger system. Without the full algorithmic framework, their predictions would be accurate some of the time, but catastrophically wrong when market conditions shifted outside the parameters they understood. They were about to make fools of themselves in front of some of the most influential investors in Chicago. Under normal circumstances, I might have found the situation amusing. But this wasn't normal circumstances. They were using my intellectual property to commit fraud, and when their demonstration inevitably failed, it would damage the reputation of predictive analytics technology that I had spent years perfecting. I needed to act, but the question was how. Confronting them publicly would create a scene that would overshadow their wedding and potentially expose my own business interests before I was ready. But allowing them to proceed with their fraudulent demonstration could have consequences that extended far beyond their personal embarrassment. The decision was made for me when I overheard Jonathan Hayes talking to Thomas Chen near the bar. The preliminary results are extraordinary, Hayes was saying. If Marcus and Rebecca can replicate those numbers consistently, we're looking at the kind of breakthrough that comes along maybe once in a generation. You're confident in the technology? Thomas asked. Completely. I've had my best analysts review their methodology, and everything checks out. The mathematical principles are sound, the historical backtesting shows remarkable accuracy, and the real-time demonstrations they've given me have been flawless. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just stolen fragments of my code, they'd somehow gotten access to enough of my work to fool professional analysts. This was no longer amateur hour theft, this was sophisticated corporate espionage. I pulled out my phone and called Jennifer again. I need you to trace every digital interaction Marcus Chen and Rebecca Sullivan have had with any of my companies or systems over the past 3 years, I said. Email communications, server access logs, third-party connections, everything. That's going to take some time. You have until tomorrow morning. Alex, what exactly are you planning? I looked across the ballroom at Marcus and Rebecca, who had returned to the dance floor but were clearly distracted by the business conversations happening around them. Their perfect wedding was becoming a launching pad for their perfect crime. and they seemed blissfully unaware that they were about to step into a trap of their own making. "I'm planning to attend their investor demonstration tomorrow," I said, as an interested observer. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Quote, Jennifer was right, of course. She knew me well enough to recognize when I was moving from defensive to offensive operations. The truth was, I hadn't decided yet how far I was willing to take this. Exposing their theft would be simple enough. I had documentation that would prove my ownership of the technology beyond any doubt. But doing so would also expose my own business empire, ending years of carefully maintained privacy. On the other hand, allowing them to defraud investors using my stolen technology would make me complicit in their crimes. And there was something else, something more personal that I was reluctant to admit even to myself. I was tired of being invisible. For 3 years, I had built something extraordinary while allowing the world to believe I was a failure. I had accumulated wealth and influence that dwarfed anything Marcus or Rebecca had achieved. But I had done it all in shadow, hidden behind corporate structures and legal protections that kept my name out of the spotlight. Watching them tonight, seeing how they basked in admiration and respect that was built on stolen work, I realized that part of me wanted recognition for what I had actually accomplished. Not for the money. I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, but for the acknowledgement that the basement dweller they had dismissed and ultimately uninvited from their wedding had, in fact, built something that neither of them could have imagined. The evening wore on with increasing intensity. More investors arrived, drawn by word of mouth about the remarkable young couple who had supposedly cracked the code on market prediction. Marcus and Rebecca held court like tech royalty, describing their breakthrough methodology with the confidence of people who genuinely believed their own lies. I remained in the background, observing, listening, gathering intelligence. Every conversation I overheard added another piece to the puzzle of how they had gained access to my work. References to collaborative research platforms and data sharing agreements suggested that somewhere in the complex web of my business operations, there had been a security breach that had given them far more access than the college study sessions I had initially suspected. As the reception wound down near midnight, I made my decision. Tomorrow's investor demonstration would be the perfect stage for revealing the truth about Marcus and Rebecca's revolutionary technology. But it would also be the end of my anonymity, the moment when Alex Morrison stepped out of the shadows and claimed credit for building one of the most sophisticated predictive analytics empires in the world. The only question now was whether I was ready for what would come next. I finished my scotch, straightened my deliberately unremarkable suit, and walked toward the exit. Tomorrow would be very interesting indeed. The Quantum Prediction Analytics office occupied the 32nd floor of a gleaming downtown Chicago tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan. I arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, carrying a leather portfolio that contained enough documentation to destroy Marcus and Rebecca's fraudulent venture within minutes. But I wasn't planning to end this quickly. The elevator opened to reveal a reception area that screamed startup success, exposed brick walls, modern furniture, and motivational phrases like disrupt the future, displayed in sleek typography. A young receptionist with perfectly styled hair and a practiced smile directed me to conference room A, where the demonstration was already underway. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus presenting to a room full of investors, his PowerPoint slides displaying complex mathematical formulas that I recognized as simplified versions of my own algorithms. Rebecca sat at a conference table surrounded by multiple monitors, her fingers dancing across keyboards as she manipulated data in real time. To anyone unfamiliar with the underlying technology, it would have looked like a seamless partnership between visionary leadership and technical expertise. "Are you here for the quantum prediction demonstration?" the receptionist asked. "Yes, Alex Morrison, from Morrison Capital." I handed her a business card that Jennifer had prepared overnight. Technically accurate, since I did operate several investment vehicles under that name, but vague enough to avoid immediate recognition. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Please go right in. They're just getting started with the live market analysis." I entered the conference room quietly, taking a seat in the back row. The investor audience was impressive. Representatives from 3 major venture capital firms, 2 hedge funds, and what appeared to be a delegation from a major bank's innovation division. Jonathan Hayes sat in the front row, his expression radiating confidence and satisfaction. Marcus was in full presentation mode, his voice carrying the evangelical fervor of a true believer. Traditional market analysis relies on historical patterns and human intuition, he was saying. Our system transcends those limitations by processing thousands of variables simultaneously, identifying correlations that human analysts simply cannot detect. On the main screen, Rebecca's interface displayed real-time market data streaming from multiple exchanges, stock prices, commodity futures, currency fluctuations, and bond yields updated in milliseconds, creating a hypnotic cascade of numbers that seemed to pulse with life. What you're about to see, Marcus continued, is our algorithm making live predictions about market movements over the next 4 hours. We'll track these predictions in real time, and by the end of today's session, you'll have concrete proof of our system's capabilities. Rebecca's fingers flew across her keyboard, and suddenly the main screen split into multiple panels. Each panel focused on a different market sector: technology stocks, pharmaceutical companies, energy futures, and precious metals. Beside each sector, prediction bars appeared, showing projected percentage movements with corresponding confidence levels. Technology sector, projected 3.7% decline, confidence level 89%, Rebecca announced, her voice steady and professional. Pharmaceutical sector, projected 1.2% increase, confidence level 92%. Energy futures, projected 6.1% increase, confidence level 85%. The investors leaned forward, their attention completely captured. Several pulled out phones to independently verify the current market positions, ensuring that the predictions weren't based on movements that had already occurred. I watched the demonstration with growing fascination, not because of the technology, I knew every line of code they were using, but because of how confidently they were misusing it. The algorithms they had stolen were powerful, but they represented only about 30% of my complete system. Without the full framework, their predictions would appear accurate during stable market conditions, but would fail catastrophically when volatility spiked or when unexpected external factors disrupted normal patterns. Today's market conditions were anything but stable. Overnight, preliminary reports had emerged about potential trade disputes between the European Union and several Asian manufacturing partners. The news hadn't been widely reported yet, but early indicators suggested significant disruptions to global supply chains. My complete system would have detected these signals through its analysis of shipping manifests, diplomatic communications patterns, and subtle shifts in commodity pricing. Marcus and Rebecca's incomplete version would miss them entirely. The beauty of our approach, Marcus continued, is its adaptability. Unlike static models that require constant human adjustment, our algorithm learns and evolves, becoming more accurate with each data point it processes. It was true, in theory. My original design did include machine learning capabilities that allowed the system to refine its predictions based on outcomes. But implementing that functionality required access to training datasets and computational resources that Marcus and Rebecca clearly didn't possess. They were running a pale shadow of the real system, powered by stolen code and sustained by ignorance of their own limitations. Mr. Hayes, one of the hedge fund representatives, said, "What kind of capital deployment are we looking at for full implementation?" Jonathan Hayes stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. Quantum Prediction Analytics is seeking $12 million in Series A funding. This will allow them to scale their infrastructure, expand their development team, and begin offering their technology to institutional clients. And the intellectual property protections? Another investor asked. Rebecca looked up from her screens with a confident smile. We have comprehensive patent applications filed for all core methodologies. Our legal team has confirmed that our innovations are completely original and defensible. I almost laughed out loud. Their legal team had apparently not bothered to check existing patents. Or they would have discovered that my provisional applications, filed just hours after Jennifer's emergency request, covered every algorithm they were attempting to claim as their own. What about competition? A bank representative inquired. This seems like the kind of breakthrough that would attract significant attention from established players. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Rebecca before responding. We've conducted extensive market research, and while there are companies working in adjacent spaces, No one has achieved the level of accuracy and real-time capability that we're demonstrating today. We believe we have at least an 18-month lead on any potential competitors. 18 months. If they only knew that their competitor was sitting 20 feet away, having built the technology they were stealing 3 years before they'd even conceived of their company. The morning session continued with increasingly detailed technical discussions. Rebecca fielded questions about processing speeds, data sources, and scalability with impressive fluency. She had clearly studied the stolen code extensively and understood its surface-level functionality, even if she missed the deeper architectural principles that made it truly revolutionary. By 11 a.m., the real-time predictions were showing mixed results. The technology sector had indeed begun declining, as Rebecca had predicted, but the pharmaceutical and energy forecasts were proving less accurate. More concerning, the confidence levels displayed by their system remained artificially high even as market volatility began increasing beyond normal parameters. I watched one of the hedge fund investors checking his phone with increasing frequency, his expression growing skeptical as he compared the predictions to actual market movements. Another investor whispered something to his colleague that made both men frown and begin taking notes. Is there a reason the confidence levels aren't adjusting as market conditions change? The bank representative asked. Rebecca's fingers hesitated over her keyboard for just a moment, long enough for me to recognize that she had encountered a problem she didn't understand how to solve. The system maintains high confidence because it's processing information that traditional indicators miss, she said smoothly. What appears to be increased volatility is actually the market responding to underlying patterns that our algorithm has already identified. It was a reasonable-sounding explanation that was completely wrong. The confidence calculations in my original system were designed to decrease automatically when market conditions moved outside established parameters. The fact that their stolen version wasn't making these adjustments meant they had failed to implement one of the most critical safety features of the entire framework. They were about to demonstrate not just the limitations of their theft, but the dangers of using sophisticated technology without understanding its fundamental principles. At 11:47 a.m., the European Union announced emergency trade restrictions in response to the overnight developments I had been tracking. Within minutes, global markets began experiencing the kind of coordinated volatility that could destroy investment portfolios in hours. Rebecca's prediction interface, still displaying confidence levels above 80%, began showing projections that were increasingly divorced from reality. The energy futures she had predicted would rise 6% were now falling by 12%. The pharmaceutical stocks she had forecasted would gain were hemorrhaging value as investors fled to safer assets. But the most damaging failure was in the technology sector, where her algorithm continued to predict further declines, even as major stocks began recovering on news that the trade restrictions would actually benefit American tech companies. The room's atmosphere shifted from excitement to concern to barely concealed alarm as investors watched their potential golden goose lay eggs that were not just ordinary but actively toxic. Perhaps we should pause the demonstration, Jonathan Hayes suggested, his voice carefully controlled but his body language radiating tension. No need, Marcus said quickly. Market volatility actually provides the best opportunity to showcase our system's superiority over traditional analysis methods. But even as he spoke, I could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead. This wasn't going according to plan, and he was smart enough to recognize that his entire future was unraveling in real time. It was time to make my entrance. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the polished concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense conference room. Every head turned toward me, and I could see the exact moment when Marcus and Rebecca recognized who had been sitting in their investor meeting for the past 2 hours. Marcus's face went through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, a kind of desperate panic that made his carefully styled hair seem suddenly disheveled, despite not having moved. Rebecca's hands froze over her keyboard, her mouth opening slightly as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "I think there might be some confusion about the technology being demonstrated here." Jonathan Hayes turned in his chair, his eyebrows raised in polite inquiry. I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison. Alex Morrison. I reached into my portfolio and withdrew a tablet, its screen already displaying the interface I had used that very morning to make my own market predictions. Predictions that had proven accurate to within fractions of percentage points while Marcus and Rebecca's stolen system failed spectacularly. I'm afraid there's been a significant misunderstanding about the origins of the technology you've been watching today. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the ambient noise from the building's ventilation system seemed to have stopped, as if the entire world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Marcus found his voice first. Alex, what are you doing here? I thought, Rebecca said you couldn't make it to the wedding. I attended the wedding, I said calmly. I was sitting in the back during your father's conversation with Mr. Hayes about this investment opportunity. Very interesting discussion about revolutionary predictive analytics technology. I tapped my tablet, and suddenly the main screen in the conference room flickered. Rebecca's interface disappeared, replaced by my own system's real-time display. The difference was immediately apparent. Where her predictions had been failing catastrophically, mine showed precise accuracy, with confidence levels that had appropriately adjusted downward as market volatility increased. This, I said, gesturing toward the screen, is what a complete predictive analytics system looks like when it's operating as designed. One of the hedge fund investors leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that you're familiar with quantum prediction analytics technology? I'm not just familiar with it, I replied. I created it 3 years ago. In my parents' basement in Columbus, Ohio, while Marcus and Rebecca were building their careers in Chicago and New York, respectively. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Jonathan Hayes was staring at the screen with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly grown several additional dimensions. That's impossible, Rebecca said, finally finding her voice. Alex, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this technology is completely original. We've spent 2 years developing these algorithms from scratch. I smiled, reaching back into my portfolio. That's interesting, Rebecca, because according to the Git commit history I have here, I pulled out a thick folder of printed documentation. The core algorithms you've been demonstrating were first written on March 15, 2022, at 3:47 a.m. The original variable names are still intact in your code, including a particularly distinctive function I called quantum leap prediction, which, coincidentally, seems to have inspired your company name. Marcus was now visibly sweating. Alex, even if you did some preliminary work in college that we built upon. College? I interrupted. Marcus, these algorithms were written a full year after we graduated. Would you like me to show everyone the email chain where you requested access to my, quote, experimental finance project for what you claimed was academic research? I handed the folder to Jonathan Hayes, who began flipping through pages of code comparisons, email communications, and development timestamps. His expression grew darker with each page. But that's not the most interesting part, I continued. The most interesting part is that what you've been demonstrating today represents approximately 30% of the complete system. You've been running a partial implementation without understanding the architectural principles that make it actually work. I turned to address the investors directly. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed this morning wasn't a failure of predictive analytics technology. It was a demonstration of what happens when sophisticated systems are implemented by people who don't understand their underlying principles. One of the bank representatives spoke up. Mr. Morrison, you're making very serious accusations. Do you have proof of these claims? Absolutely. I pulled out my phone and called Jennifer, putting the call on speaker. Jennifer, please read the provisional patent filing numbers for our predictive analytics systems. Jennifer's voice came through clearly. Provisional patent application 63,847,390 seconds, filed January 15, 2025, covering multivariable market forecasting systems and related methodologies. Priority date established 3 years prior based on documented development history and implementation records. That was filed, I added, approximately 6 hours after Rebecca called to uninvite me from their wedding. Curious timing, wouldn't you say? Quote. The room was now completely silent except for the sound of Jonathan Hayes turning pages and occasionally muttering under his breath. Marcus and Rebecca sat frozen, their faces pale and their carefully constructed presentation completely derailed. "Mr. Hayes," I said, "you mentioned yesterday that your analysts had reviewed their methodology and found it sound. I'd be curious to know if those analysts had access to the complete system architecture, or just the fragments that Marcus and Rebecca were able to reverse engineer." Hayes looked up from the documents, his expression thunderous. "Mr. Chen, Ms. Sullivan, I think we need to have a very different conversation than the one we planned." "Jonathan, there's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding," Marcus began. "The misunderstanding," I interrupted, "is that you believed you could steal 3 years of my work, implement it incorrectly, and use it to defraud investors without consequences." I walked to the front of the room, my tablet still controlling the main display. "Would you like to see what the complete system actually looks like?" Without waiting for an answer, I pulled up my full interface. The screen filled with data streams that made Rebecca's demonstration look like a child's toy. Real-time analysis of global shipping patterns, diplomatic communication sentiment analysis, patent filing trend analysis, social media sentiment mapping across 47 languages, and predictive modeling that incorporated everything from weather patterns to political stability indices. "This is Morrison Predictive Analytics," I said. "The company you've never heard of because we don't need publicity to be successful. Our clients include Tesla, Amazon, Goldman Sachs, and approximately 40% of the Fortune 500. We manage investment strategies worth over $2.3 billion, and our accuracy rate over the past 3 years has been 94.7%. The numbers hung in the air like a physical presence. Several investors were furiously taking notes, while others appeared to be researching my claims on their phones. "Impossible," Rebecca whispered. "Alex, you've been living in your parents' basement. You drive a 15-year-old Honda. You buy your clothes at Men's Warehouse." "Yes," I finished. "Excellent observation, Rebecca. Tell me, what's the first rule of effective wealth management?" She stared at me blankly. "Don't announce your wealth to people who might want to take it from you." I gestured around the room, though I suppose I'm breaking that rule today for obvious reasons. Jonathan Hayes stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Marcus, Rebecca, I need to speak with you privately now." "Actually," I said, "I think this conversation should remain public. These investors deserve to understand exactly what they were being asked to fund." I turned back to my tablet and pulled up another interface. "This is the real-time performance comparison between your stolen system and my complete implementation, tracked over the past 4 hours." 2 columns of data appeared on the screen. The left column showed Marcus and Rebecca's predictions alongside actual market outcomes, a devastating record of failures that would have cost investors millions. The right column showed my system's predictions, accurate to within fractions of a percent across every major market sector. As you can see, the difference between partial theft and complete understanding is the difference between profit and bankruptcy. One of the hedge fund investors raised his hand. "Mr. Morrison, assuming your claims are accurate, what exactly are you proposing here?" It was the question I had been building toward for the past 24 hours, and suddenly I realized I had multiple answers. "I'm proposing several things," I said. "First, quantum prediction analytics immediately cease all operations based on stolen intellectual property and return any investor funds that have been committed based on fraudulent demonstrations." Marcus started to object, but I continued. "Second, that Mr. Hayes and his fellow investors consider the possibility that the real opportunity in predictive analytics lies not with amateur thieves, but with the actual creator of the technology they've been seeking." I paused, letting that sink in. "And third, that Marcus and Rebecca learn an important lesson about the consequences of underestimating people based on superficial judgments." Jonathan Hayes was staring at me with the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. "Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that Morrison Predictive Analytics might be open to investment partnerships?" "I'm suggesting that Morrison Predictive Analytics has been operating successfully without external investment for 3 years, but might be open to discussing strategic partnerships with organizations that share our commitment to ethical business practices." Quote. I looked directly at Marcus and Rebecca. Unfortunately, that would exclude anyone involved with quantum prediction analytics. The next 20 minutes were a blur of intense conversations, hastily canceled investor commitments, and what appeared to be several extremely uncomfortable phone calls. Marcus and Rebecca sat in stunned silence as their entire venture collapsed around them, their stolen technology exposed and their credibility destroyed. Jonathan Hayes approached me as the other investors began filing out of the conference room. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology. If I had done proper due diligence." "You did exactly what any reasonable investor would do," I said. "You evaluated a presentation that appeared to demonstrate revolutionary technology. The failure wasn't in your analysis, it was in their deception. Still, I'd like to make this right. Would you be interested in discussing how Hayes Capital might work with Morrison Predictive Analytics?" I considered the offer. 3 years of operating in shadow had been productive, but watching Marcus and Rebecca's presentation had reminded me that there were advantages to strategic visibility. "Send me a proposal," I said, "but understand that any partnership would be on terms very different from what you were discussing with them." As Hayes left, I found myself alone in the conference room with Marcus and Rebecca. They sat at their presentation table, surrounded by the monitors and cables that had been meant to showcase their stolen dreams. "Alex," Marcus said finally, "we never meant for things to go this far. It started as just inspiration from your college work." "Inspiration?" I laughed. "Marcus, you took code that I spent 3 years perfecting and tried to build a company around it. That's not inspiration, that's theft." Rebecca looked up, her eyes red with tears that she was fighting not to shed. "What happens now? Are you going to sue us?" I thought about the question seriously. I could sue them. I could probably destroy them financially and professionally. I could ensure that neither of them ever worked in technology again. But looking at them now, sitting in the wreckage of their fraudulent venture, I realized that they had already paid a price that was perhaps more valuable than any court judgment. "What happens now," I said, "is that you learn to build something original, something that belongs to you, something that doesn't require stealing from people you consider beneath you." Quote, I packed my tablet back into my portfolio and headed for the door. "Alex, wait," Rebecca called. "How did you do it? How did you build all of this while we thought you were failing?" I paused at the threshold. "Rebecca, you uninvited me from your wedding because you thought I was an embarrassment. You assumed that because I wasn't flaunting success, I wasn't successful. That assumption was your first mistake. And our second mistake? Believing that intelligence and achievement are always visible. The most powerful empires are often built by people you never notice, in places you never look, by individuals who understand that true success doesn't require an audience." I stepped into the hallway, leaving them to contemplate the ruins of their stolen dreams. Outside the building, I called Jennifer. "How did it go?" she asked. "Exactly as planned. Schedule a board meeting for next week. I think it's time for Morrison Predictive Analytics to step out of the shadows." "And the wedding crashers?" I smiled, thinking about Marcus and Rebecca sitting in their empty conference room, finally understanding the difference between appearing successful and actually building something meaningful. They're learning an important lesson about the cost of underestimating basement dwellers. As I walked toward my deliberately unremarkable Honda Civic, I realized that the most satisfying part of the entire experience wasn't exposing their theft or destroying their fraudulent venture. It was the moment when Marcus froze, looked at me standing in that conference room, and finally understood exactly who he had been talking to all along. The basement dweller who had quietly built an empire while they were busy building facades. And the best part? This was just the beginning. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.